Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Rogue Insider podcast. I'm very happy to have back Hugh Dingwall on the station again. Today we are going to be discussing Cyberpunk, the genre, not the recent game, although I'm sure it will come up. How many years has it been since Neuromancer got released? Must be on the high side of 25 now.
Yeah. So that's one of the many things I opened in a tab, so I would know what I was talking about. Neuromancer was released in 1984, and from memory, like Blade Runner is something like Blade Runner's 82. So yeah, if you take those as kind of central works, kind of solidifying what the thing is and what it's about, then that's nearly almost as old as me.
It's coming up on 40 years, which is not a great sign for, well, you, me, or any of the subjects of this conversation. But nevertheless, that's how it is. So coming up on 40 years seems like a good time for a retrospective, particularly because I have the impression, and let me know if you share this, that Cyberpunk as a genre seems to have exhausted itself because reality has caught up to such a degree that there's no potential for shock or awe in the genre anymore.
Yeah, I think that's a fair critique. Certainly, the thing that set me on the path to having the thoughts that led me to saying, "Hey, can we talk about this in particular?" was the conversations that we were having when we did the last episode, where we got into these little digressions about the cyberpunk future that we're currently living in. And I thought, kind of, yeah, we are in a number of ways. But I think one of the things about cyberpunk is that it was always a near future science fiction genre, which means that it's now thoroughly in the realm of hauntology. Let me just flip through my tabs again, because I remember I set some things up so I could have some dates for you.
Great.
So Blade Runner takes place in the year, I believe, 2019. Yes, Blade Runner happens in 2019. Neon Genesis Evangelion, which I do kind of half count as cyberpunk, happens in 2016. I think Neuromancer and Snow Crash, the authors were smart enough to not attach dates to them, but Ghost in the Shell is nebulously set in the mid-21st century. So we could be charitable and say we expect Ghost in the Shell in about 20 to 30 years. And so, like, you're really getting into the kind of retro futurology stuff now. You know, we're looking at this media that said that, like, 3 years ago we ought to have flying cars. I think that is a major way it loses its impact. The other thing is, I think there were a lot of assumptions about the way that the world was going to turn out, not just in terms of like technological expectations, but in terms of like political structures and that sort of thing, that were based on very much predictions based on the 1980s through perhaps the early 90s, and which have kind of come true, but not in the way that the authors expected.
Yeah, there has definitely been a series of developments, and it doesn't feel like Cyberpunk was ever accurate. But on the other hand, I'm not convinced that Cyberpunk was ever intentionally predictive. It always felt like it, to me anyway, that it talked about the near future in order to illustrate things about the present, or at the very least about the thrust and direction of the present and where it might go. I started reading Neuromancer again. This is the cover of my Neuromancer book. And one of the nice things about rereading it was, previously when I had read it, I had found it very disorienting, and so a lot of it I didn't understand. Now I found it really clear and not disorienting at all. I was like, oh yeah, I understand what's going on. But there was lots of points in it where I was like, oh, that's where that comes from. Ghost in the Shell, the thermoptic camouflage, that occurs in Neuromancer when he gets delivered a message, like some messenger boy just steps out of the shadows and is like, here you are, and then zoop, it disappears. Yeah. But the thing that, but to go back to the beginning, the thing that became clear to me is how much Cyberpunk is the combination of film noir and science fiction in the Philip K. Dick sense of that word.
Yeah, I think that's a very fair assessment, and I think in the same way that film noir was because that came out of hard-boiled detective fiction. The thing that was innovative about hard-boiled detective fiction was that it took murders, because detective fiction is mostly murders, but it took them out of like upper crust garden parties with a highly cultivated detective in the vein of Poirot. These kind of beautiful puzzle box novels, and instead everything was about the machinations of people who had power or were after power or were after money, and in a really straightforwardly understandable way. Like you could, everyone who read hard-boiled novels when they were new knew what corrupt city officials were like, because they were notoriously corrupt. They knew what speakeasies and gangsters were like, because they probably had to deal with them, and they knew, like, there's something very relatable about the idea of people doing terrible things for very low stakes, because they feel like their options are so limited. I mean, that's the entire filmography of the Coen brothers, whether or not they're doing noir in any given movie. They always come back to that, like, bad people doing bad things for bad reasons.
Yep. Reminds me of that saying from The Shadow, who knows what evil lurks in the hearts of men? The Shadow knows. But that's exactly right. In Neuromancer, and the heroes, and here's something that's just occurred to me. The hero of Neuromancer, or anti-hero or whatever, his name is Case, right? And what happens in schlock fiction, they always try and crack the case, right?
Yeah.
That can't be a coincidence. But yeah, when he's coming down off one of his various speeded out days where he takes all of these little purple octagons to try and, get fast enough to catch up on how he used to feel when he was a web runner, some junkie chick begs money off him, and he tries to, give her $50, and she's kind of hesitant, which surprises him, and then she says, as a tip, so-and-so is going to try and have you whacked, and because he's so paranoid, he takes it seriously, and then spends like a couple of days running around desperately trying to get away from this guy. While that's happening, she breaks into his coffin motel, steals the RAM out of his hard drive, which is worth a couple of $100, sells it off, and then the guy who he works for comes up to him and goes, why would you think that I would try and kill you, and who would tell you such a ridiculous idea? You work for me. Bad actions for low stakes.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think if we can kind of progress into one of the things that I feel like Cyberpunk got wrong in an interesting way, I think one of the things that cyberpunk settings in particular often lean on is this idea of kind of the corporatization of government. Neuromancer from memory has the sort of the idea of the all-powerful corporation that shows up in various other things. I'm thinking also of like settings like Shadowrun, which is kind of like fantasy with your cyberpunk, but that has corporations pretty much completely replacing municipal governments, so people are citizens of corporations instead of governments. And the thing that I found really interesting reading some more modern cyberpunk adjacent sci-fi was that the extent to which corporate incompetence was kind of left out of the original cyberpunk mythos. Like, individual people are incompetent, but the corporations themselves function more or less as they're intended to. Whereas there's a story called Unauthorized Bread, which is part of a novella called Radicalized, which is like, it's part of a collection of novellas called Radicalized, which is by Cory Doctorow. It's like 4 novellas in one volume. And the inciting incident of Unauthorized Bread is that there's this woman who lives in an affordable apartment built in a high rise, and the catch of the affordable apartments for refugees is that you're not allowed any appliances that don't come with the apartment, and all of the appliances are corporate appliances that only work with like specific bread in your toaster, and like you have to use your kettle in a particular way and all of this stuff. And the inciting incident is that her toaster, the company that owns her toaster, gets what's the term, like asset stripped by another company. And so suddenly she can't make any food because that's the only way she has of making food in her apartment. And it's no longer supported by the corporation because of like financial shenanigans, which are completely unrelated to her. Yeah. And that kind of like, suddenly this thing I need to live just doesn't work because of like Internet of Things support. That was a thing that I don't think ever occurred to William Gibson at the time.
Well, Gibson used the term zaibatsu, which I've no idea whether that's a genuine Japanese word or if he made it up and it sounds right.
Well, it's in Tekken. You're in Tekken, you're fighting for the control of the Mishima Zaibatsu, so...
All right. It must be.
Whatever that contributes to the conversation.
Tekken was made in Japan, right? So yeah. Either it's correct or it got sent there and came back, and now it's correct. Yeah. But yeah, assuming that our world's kind of zaibatsu, the original sort of royal houses of Japan, when they switched their names to become the major corporations of Japan, and I don't know what the relationship is between the corporations and the state in Japan, but I assume it's extremely tightly interwoven to the degree that it's inseparable. Or a good example would be Samsung in South Korea. Samsung, the conglomerate which makes everything, constitutes 60% of the GDP of South Korea. So, that's another good example. And then, of course, there's all of the massive tech corporations that come out of the United States. Or the relationship of the way that the Chinese Communist Party penetrates all of its sort of, production arms. You have to have a CCP member on your board if you have a major corporation. They never achieve any sort of independence. So there's definitely some amount of overlap there. But in terms of just raw, independent corporate power managing to lever itself away from the overbearing kind of legalism of the state, the best example I can think of that is maybe the behavior of the oil corporations in Nigeria. Like they're...
Yeah, I mean, so in one way, the idea of the corporation kind of usurping the state is actually a reach backwards, because that is more or less what you had when, like, the British East India Company was running India. You had an entire country run essentially by a corporation for profit. Similarly with like Belgian colonization of the Congo, they invented a country to colonize because the Congo wasn't a country until they said, this bit of the world that we control, it's all one country now. Yeah. And you will work for us harvesting rubber and we'll chop off your hands if you don't. But so, I mean, that's a thing that's already existed. I think a thing that I became aware of that I wasn't super aware of, that I became aware of through this podcast, Trash Future, that I mentioned before you hit record, is the extent to which there are corporations which are slowly like slicing off little bits of the function of a state. and so there is a kind of corporatization by degrees happening. There's I've completely forgotten the name of the company, but I think the guy who runs it is called Rex Greensill. He's an Australian businessman, and what he's invented is a way of doing what's called supply chain finance, which is a complicated way of basically buying things and avoiding paying for them immediately by putting a middleman service in the way. But what it's meant in effect is that he has granted himself the ability, which is normally reserved for a government-controlled bank, to just kind of make money out of nothing in order to change the amount of money in the economy. And he is already providing this service to a number of countries who are, for reasons which are kind of mysterious to me, but I think ideological, quite happy to not make money out of nothing themselves, which they used to do quite readily, but instead have this Australian man do it, and somehow that fits with their goals better. So, but I can see that sort of thing like slowly progressing in a direction where maybe instead of being entirely usurped, a government could fracture into a series of corporations.
Yeah. My concern with the corporate versus state analysis is that I always feel like it undervalues how much the state is its own political entity, which ought to be something which is really obvious, and that there's no way in hell that the power that is clustered inside the state is going to let itself be, weaned away under any circumstances, and especially because the military is under the control of the state, and the armed forces, at least in wealthy Western countries, are under civilian control, or they operate under civilian oversight. They're tasked by civilians. So my measure of true corporate independence would be when corporations have independent armies. Now, to be fair, in the modern world, corporations do have independent armies in a lot of circumstances. But
and in fact, the American government outsources a not insignificant bit of its military adventurism to various private corporations as well.
Eric Prince ran Z, I think it was called for a while.
He's had a dozen of them because they keep doing war crimes, and then he goes away and comes back with a different name and does it again, and they do a different war crime and he does it again. Yeah.
But even under those circumstances, until a corporate army wins a war against a state army, I'm still not quite there. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I can see that. I guess the thing that I was struck by was the idea that rather than being dominated by an ever-present malicious force of some sort, that people's lives were instead being disrupted by a force which had kind of made itself indispensable and then failed to do its job.
Yeah. Allow me for a moment to elucidate the kind of geopolitical background of the beginning of the cyberpunk genre, because it's something that is not necessarily obvious straight away just looking at the genre. But at the end of the Cold War, well, they didn't know the Cold War was about to end, but in the early 80s, in the United States, there was a lot of concern about the speed at which Japan was growing economically, and so all of the fears which we now have about China, China's going to grow exponentially and take over the world, those exact fears were operating in Japan, or operating in the United States about Japan. So if you look at the growth of GDP in Japan, it goes from the Second World War pretty much at a 45-degree angle up and to the right until the early to late 80s, and then the United States sends some trade negotiators, and then it goes flat from then until now. Yeah, and that's pretty much a deliberate state economic policy decision from the United States just to go, hey, okay, that's enough of that now. But at the time that these were written, that hadn't occurred yet. So that is kind of like the reason why all of these Japanese zaibatsu are regarded as being so omnipotent, is because it's the, if not a prediction, at least a representation of a fear of what was going on at that time.
Oh yeah, and that's the reason for all of the like half fearful, half fetishistic Japanese iconography in a lot of these stories as well. I mean, it's the reason that your fighter class in Shadowrun is called a street samurai, for example.
Exactly, like this chromed up chick here.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah, so in some sense we could say that the history of cyberpunk is the history of Japanese-US relations. Yeah.
Yeah, I think so, and about ideas about where those were going to go. The other thing that I thought was interesting is the sense in which there's this idea that information technology sort of begins to approach magic, which is interesting, because then, you know, things like Shadowrun put in actual magic at the same time. But you know, Ghost in the Shell allows essentially spirit possession, for want of a better term, through technological means. The kind of reverence for people who can do cyberspace in William Gibson is sort of magic-y adjacent. And I was struck, because I've been listening to the podcast, and I was listening to your conversations with Ari Freeman, but I was struck by two things. First, the way that what we call AI, so we don't actually have artificial intelligence. What we have is a way of teaching a computer to recognize stuff by brute force, because we can now throw an awful lot of computing power at it.
Yeah, and a sophisticated spreadsheet, right?
Yeah, kind of. Yeah,
that's
like,
what's doing this.
Yeah, exactly. The very basic idea is that you show a computer a picture of two things and you tell it that one of them is a duck and the other one isn't, and then you do that again, and you do that enough times, and then eventually a computer can reliably go, that picture is a duck. But the way in which it becomes like working with a servitor demon of some sort is that you can never know why the computer made the decision it did. So it could be the example that I read from someone who was working training these neural nets is that you could have accidentally only ever given it a picture of ducks sitting on water, so it's decided that things that are on water adjacent backgrounds are ducks, and until you diversify your training data it won't learn that there are other aspects to duckness than that. But even like, no matter how much you expand your training data, because you can never actually get to infinite, because we don't have enough, you know, we don't have infinite computing power or infinite pictures of ducks. You will never know exactly why it thinks something is a duck or not a duck, and so it becomes a process of kind of invoking the correct response from this thing that is not a being but becomes a being-like process, if you see what I mean.
Yeah. When in the podcast where I was discussing with Jason of Vidi.world about he mentioned a curious case where a client of his was having troubles with Instagram, and all of their work was getting just pummeled, was not getting any engagement, and they got in touch with the people at Instagram through corporate and said what's going on, and they said, we'll have a talk with our devs. And after a thorough investigation into what was going on and some deep diving into the code with the devs, they came back with the answer, we don't know.
Yeah, we have no idea. And so there are a couple of different blogs where people who work with neural nets, essentially for comedy, but also as a kind of teaching tool about the way that they work, do things like feed them the little heart-shaped sweets with the sentimental motto on them. I forget what they're called, love hearts or something.
Yeah, I know the ones you mean.
They give them the mottos off those as training data, and then they tell the neural net to spit back something that it thinks is an appropriate response based on the data it's been given. And the thing that often comes out is that they develop obsessions. Like they'll get stuck on a particular word, and just every third thing it generates will be about cats or farts or like whatever the thing is that it's just locked into. And it takes like patient training to get it unstuck from whatever the single like word or phrase is that it's become obsessed with.
Yeah.
And it's doing this by free associating without a mind to free associate with.
Yeah. In my imagination, and I don't know enough about computers to have any idea whether this is accurate or not, but in my imagination, the idea space is like a big spongy thing, and you take objects and push it on it, and it leaves an impression pushed into it, and you just do that over and over again. And generally speaking, after a couple of million of impressions, the spongy space has the impression of the object close enough that that's something that can read the idea space. The computer can go, oh yeah, this is close enough.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good enough metaphor, and it relates to what Ari was talking about, in the sense that you might not necessarily 100% understand the mechanism of what you're doing if you're a magical practitioner, but your interest, or at least his interest, and I think he was implying that it should be people's interest, is like, does this thing that I am doing work, and does it work reliably enough for me? And talking about like not just does tarot work, but what things does tarot work for? And you kind of have to have very much that approach to it.
Well, yeah, the magic analogy is worth dwelling on. I mean, neuromancer, the name means a magician of the mind, right? What was the first term that was applied to hackers, or sorry, second term after hackers, in the 60s and 70s? It was, computer wizards, right? And what was the general mindset and analogy that was used by those computer wizards, right? Invoking a program, summoning daemons, right? The whole magic is seeded through the entire technological layer when it comes to information technology.
Yeah, if you send an email to an address that doesn't exist to this day, you will get a reply from a demon that says, "I'm sorry, I couldn't find the thing that you told me to go and look for."
Dumb homunculi, get out!
Yeah. Select the homunculus and make it work faster. The other thing that relates to the history of magic is that there's this fascinating period in terms of the history of scams. Now I'm not certain of my dates here, but I think you'll recognize the period I'm talking about. It's the point at which it's not trivially easy, but reasonably easy to travel around Europe. But communication between various nation states, which is still quite small and mostly ruled by personal monarchies, isn't that great. So it's a plausible career choice for someone who's reasonably charming and good at languages to just travel around Europe endlessly claiming to kings that they can turn lead into gold, and then skipping town before they quite get caught and like moving on to the next kingdom over and doing it again. And we are now at a point where people are doing that with app development, essentially. Like they are presenting themselves to venture capital funds and saying, I have an app which does something which is patently impossible, or replicates something that's already an available public service but does it worse. But I'm going to say the word AI and you will give me $500 million.
Yeah.
And then they do, and then the company, like, stock inflates in price, they sell up and get out, the company explodes, and they do it again with a different thing which has a different name.
Yeah, there was
and it follows the same pattern.
There was a term for this in the 90s, which I'm trying to remember. Like, there used to be freeware and shareware and all of that kind of thing. But there was a type of ware that...
are you thinking about vaporware?
Yeah,
like
vaporware.
The idea of, like, software that just never actually materialized.
Yeah, because in those days, corporate didn't know anything about technology. So you could go up to them and say, you guys need this. I'll do it for you. This is how much it will cost. Let's go. And then the software just never shows up.
Yeah, and because, like, 10% of the time that guy has just invented spreadsheets while everybody else is still writing in physical ledgers, there is this kind of incentive for corporate to want to be in on it, but they don't ever know quite enough to make that not a viable scam.
Well, I guess in some sense you could paint the .com bubble as the moment when the total collections of scams got so big that it was generally acknowledged that it was a fairly scammy environment.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment, and I mean it exploded and wrecked everything. But even now, there is a generation of people who kind of sit on the line between comedian and investigative reporter, who all have their jobs in media, largely down to Cracked.com firing every person who was a talented writer on their staff all at once, because Facebook managed to convince everyone for a hot minute that embedded video on Facebook specifically, like not linking YouTube videos to Facebook, but actually uploading videos into Facebook itself and having Facebook be a video platform, was going to be the way of the future, and that was literally what every company had to do or die. And lots of people lost a huge amount of money, and that's only like 5-10 years ago.
Yeah. It's so, in some sense, one of the things that Cyberpunk got right is just how bonkers the connected world is, even if the necessary kind of exactly what type of bonk noise it makes when you hit it together, even if they never quite got that exactly right. Like the weird kind of, you wake up in the morning and discover that you're a bug, kind of element of it is there. It was one of those situations where you don't necessarily need to read the article because the headline is sufficient. But Vice.com threw out a headline that I saw about a guy who'd had his dick trapped in a BDSM cage because it was internet connected, and someone hacked it and held him to ransom. Well, I'm sure he loved that. Yeah, and so my assumption that it's only going to get weirder.
Well, I think so, because the other comparison with the conversations about magic that you're having that I thought was interesting is that we have witnessed in, again, I think the last 5 years, the creation and then invocation out of fiction space into like real space, in the sense of real enough inside people's heads to do magic with, of like an entity that was created whole cloth enough that we can actually pinpoint a singular author. So Slender Man was created by a guy called Eric Knudsen on the Something Awful forums, and can be linked to a specific post where the original 2 inciting doctored photographs were posted by Knudsen, without much in the way of additional fiction, and that then created enough additional fiction around it that it developed its own mythos, and then bled from the internet into actual mind space at the point where a 12-year-old girl attempted to sacrifice her friend to it.
Jeepers. Yeah, I mean, information technology and an information technology rich environment only increases the ability of the intellectual space to be more shareable and rich and dynamic. So, you know, in retrospect, maybe we should have predicted that as well.
Yeah, I think particularly if you look at something like, am I thinking of Neuromancer, or am I thinking of something else where people use their brains to go on the internet? But certainly one of those early cyberpunk novels does have a protagonist talking with AIs who are sort of like detached god type entities, and the corporate spaces, or sorry, the online spaces of corporations become these kind of cultivated other worlds when you access them through the portals that you're allowed to use to access them, and so you've got, you know, Hassan Isaba's paradise on the mountain that you can only come to with permission, being kind of built in there.
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed about reading Neuromancer again, although I'm only read the first couple of chapters again, was how much the experience of being online was a massive, transcendent, all-encompassing, hyper-real. Not that the experience of being online these days isn't also a hyper-real, but in Neuromancer it's something that's so far beyond the experience of the material world that it's a punishment to have to come off it, and the demands of the body are interpreted as just the meat talking, you know, and so and you can see that same thing as well in sort of 90s films like Hackers and that kind of stuff, where the experience of going online is rendered into this whole new world which is rapidly transforming, and that you're fully integrated within it. Compared to that, the kind of corporatized online environment of just banal, like incredibly tedious I don't even really want to call them conversations, but sort of invoked mutual reactions against each other over and over again is, yeah.
Yeah, I think a thing that it reminds me of a thing that I discovered when I was. Do you know? Sorry, I'm having too many thoughts at once, and I would organize them into a sentence for you. Have you heard of a food writer called Michael Pollan?
No.
Okay, so he's an American food writer. He writes about attempting to eat ethically. Interestingly, he talks about trying to eat ethically while still consuming animal products, which is not a thing that, like, lots of people go, anything to do with raising animals is unsustainable, and he has a more nuanced view, which is quite interesting. The point that I'm getting to with this is that in the course of one of his books, he talks to a guy who worked in food science developing highly processed food. And that guy talked about this idea called a bliss point. Have you heard of a bliss point?
I've heard of a bliss ball.
Okay, well, they're not unrelated. So a bliss point is you can add sugar to almost any food, and it will make it in the short term more palatable. Because humans, because we come from apes, and we have these enormous, very hungry brains, we really crave sugar because we come from an environment where it was very rare, and if you found some, you should just shove it in your chimp face as fast as you could because you wouldn't get any more. And it was good stuff for your brain. So if you add some sugar to basically anything, it will make it more palatable. And the bliss point is the point at which you cannot add more sugar and make something more palatable.
Okay.
And so the reason that sugar, if you know how you list ingredients in like from most to least on a food package, the reason that sugar is always like second or third or fourth is that almost everything that's processed these days is bliss pointed. Like they've added as much sugar as they can feasibly add to it before it starts to taste weird. Because until the point where it tastes weird, it always makes it more palatable to most people. And I feel like social media in particular is like the old web, like bliss pointed. Like they worked out how you would just maximize the fastest hit of whatever the engagement that people were getting was. Not necessarily the most satisfying, but just how can you replicate that the quickest? And that's the kind of engagement that it's geared towards, because that makes the numbers tick and the lines go up, which is its own kind of, like the cult of the line go up is its own it's its own worship of an imaginary human construct.
Sure. It's the technocratic ideal. Yeah, and then with like the layer of addictive roulette wheel, just to keep you coming back. That's my experience with Twitter. I never understood what Twitter was for. When I started using it, I was like, I don't understand what this is, and now I check it as soon as I wake up, and it's the last thing I do before I go to sleep. You know, appalling behaviour, but there we are.
Yeah, and no, it's very like that. I think I found the best thing I can do with Twitter is to like try and neutralize FOMO as much as possible, because I found that that's the agitating thing about it for me is that I am a nerdy person with some traits that are just right on the edge of neurotypical, and as a result, the like, I know something about that urge is really, really strong in me. And that's the thing about Twitter. Like someone will say something and it won't be like a person that you know or are in any way related to, but because you can see it, you get like, I know a thing about that. And you have to jump in and demonstrate that you know the thing about the thing.
Yeah, I've recently become aware that it takes only the tiniest quantity of validation to create a huge amount of motivation. Yeah.
Yes.
So
yeah.
So that's something that Cyberpunk was right about: addiction to technology. Right? We just didn't realise that it was going to be a deliberately implemented corporate maneuver, rather than just kind of like an accidental thing where your lifestyle, because you're so embedded with it, you start to feel like you're a fish out of water if you're not online. Rather, it was HQ going, you know what, I bet they would click way more if we randomised the rewards.
Yeah, because, I mean, that's the thing. If you, going back to, is it Skinner's animal experiments?
Yeah, the old Skinner box.
Well, so that was the point where they discovered that you can induce like magical ritualized behavior in pigeons if you give them randomized rewards. Like if you give a pigeon a treat when it pushes a button, it will push the button. If you give it a treat every like third time it pushes the button, it will push the button till the treat comes. If you give it a treat entirely at random, no matter how many times it pushes the button, it will start like walking in circles with one wing stuck out like this, or like bobbing back and forth. Like it'll develop this kind of ritualized behavior, trying to, because it's lost the capacity to connect cause and effect. So it just kind of does whatever the thing was that seemed to be most effective the last time it got a treat.
Interesting. Peter Sloterdijk has put forward the suggestion that the foundation of magic was, in ancient days, was based on the attempt to negotiate with the gods of beneficence, the the acceleration of the level of rewards that were coming, because unlike in these days where you receive, generally speaking, the same amount of calories every day, in those days, in ancient times, you would not eat for a week, and then you would eat, as much mammoth as you could for like 2 days or whatever, and then you'd be walking for a couple of days and nothing, and then you'd find a beehive. So his suggestion is that magic was started on the basis of trying to invoke those lucky events at maximum efficiency, which is pretty much an exact replication of what the pigeon's doing in the Skinner box.
And that does relate. Now, this is not an area where I'm an actual expert, but I have a friend from the culture who told me things about it once. My understanding is that relates reasonably closely to like the Finnish tradition of witchcraft and magic. Which is, as I understand it, so Finns get mad at me if you like, but as I understand it, it's related to the idea that luck is a sort of resource that you can have, like a pool of it attached to you. And so the job of witchcraft is to like take it from one place and put it in a different place. And so you might try and like draw it out of a place so you can have it, or you might find someone who's got a lot of it and try and steal all of theirs. But it's very much that idea that like beneficence or luck is a thing that you can kind of harvest and hold.
Interesting. I wonder how that belief is being altered in Finland now with the introduction of high-speed information technologies. I mean, Linux comes from Finland, right?
Yes, yeah, it does. It does. I mean, it's about making your machine slave as obedient as possible to you personally, rather than to someone somewhere else.
True. All right. Let's move on to another thing that I'd like to talk about, Cyberpunk. I feel like the metaphor of, or the original kind of founding principle or visual metaphor of Cyberpunk is being misinterpreted these days. And let me expand on that. I think the central principle, visually speaking, of Cyberpunk, and the one which provides the most impact and what really made it gel in people's minds, was the implantation of technology into the body. I think that was really what made things... Yeah, that's really what impacted people. The desecration of the outside-inside barrier is what caused people to have a strong reaction to Cyberpunk, and that's part of what caused it to come about. And I think the people are sometimes misunderstanding that. Like, that can be understood at just the banal level, right? The technology goes in the body because that's where it needs to be. But I think it was originally considered... It was already a metaphor. Like, it was not intended to be taken literally in the first place. It was supposed to be a metaphor for corporate and state or any other variety of external power able to impose itself on the human in a place, in a way that the human wasn't able to reject, or due to circumstances chose, even though they wouldn't have chosen it under any other circumstances. And so there's two ways that can be misinterpreted. One, the banal one, where we say, the technology goes in the body and that's all there is to it. And you can either have like a positive or a negative one, like, oh, that's horrible, or oh, that's cool. But both of those are misinterpretations. And then the second one, the second misinterpretation is that it's somehow something to do with like some sort of efficiency argument or something like that, where it seems pretty clear to me that the literal investment of technologies in the body was never really the point in the first place.
Yeah, I think so. Just firstly, to talk to your first point about that's the thing that gets people. When I first saw, I saw the anime of Ghost in the Shell, the original movie, before I read the book. And the thing that just, you know how, I don't know if this is an experience that you still have. It's an experience I had a lot as a teenager and have less now, but still occasionally, of like, you watch a thing and it just somehow seeps in your brain and pries something open and just stays in your head, gumming things up for like a week to a month. Ghost in the Shell did that for me. And the thing in Ghost in the Shell that did that for me was specifically, it's like a really minor subplot towards the beginning of the movie where the team are tracking this terrorist who's making hacking attempts from various places around, is it Neo Tokyo that they're in? I know it's Neo Tokyo in Evangelion. Anyway, they're making hacking attempts from all around, and eventually they track down this guy, and he's a garbage man who keeps diverting his route to use this special card in essentially like a payphone, because he met a guy in a pub who gave it to him, and he's convinced that what he's trying to do is get back in touch with his estranged wife who won't let him see his kids. But on investigation, he's never been married and he doesn't have any kids. And he's been used as a cat's paw in this hacking attempt, which happens for some plot reason that's not important to go into right now. But just the idea that someone could have like this fundamental bit of their personality just removed and replaced with something else more convenient at someone else's whim, for something that wasn't even really to do with them, it was to get to an unrelated third party. That just gummed up my brain for freaking ages.
Ghost in the Shell had a massive impact on me. It was, and still does, actually. I'm probably going to watch it after this conversation is over, now that we've talked about it. But there's a great moment where they catch a guy and he says, beat me all you want, I'm not going to talk. And Barto's just like, what exactly would you talk about? Do you even know your own name? You know, who are your parents? Where were you born? What school did you go to? There's nothing there.
No, it's terrifying. But to talk to your other point, I think you're entirely right. If you look at the lady behind you, Molly the Razor Girl, she's not someone. Those aren't sunglasses. Those are the surfaces of her eyeballs, for one thing. She's also got blades that come out from under her fingernails, and I think a bunch of other augmentations as well. And those were not choices that she made. Those were investments made in her by a company to make her fit their aims better. Oh no, I'm mixing up this with Johnny Mnemonic, which is also Gibson. But in Johnny Mnemonic, there's a guy who works for one of the Zaibatsus who's tracking Johnny and his also super muscle female love interest, I think. But this is a guy who's been genetically engineered by the Zaibatsu to be as forgettable as possible, so that he can blend into any crowd. And he's just this like slightly melancholy looking Japanese man who coincidentally can take off his thumb and swing it round his head on a length of monofilament fiber that will cut through anything, because his job is to get really close to people and then like reduce them to tiny slivers. And that's all he does, and he was grown for that purpose. And I think, it's impossible to separate that from the idea that people are, the idea of people being shaped for purposes that are not their own. And I think in the way that fiction always is, that's in some ways a commentary on its own time, but our time as well, in the sense that, like, the most obvious example is probably something like military training, or infantry training, where there is a period of the training which sometimes takes and sometimes does not, but is explicitly designed to kind of render a human personality back to its barest bits, so that you can then use the chunks to build up one that's like based on the previous one and contiguous with it, but more suitable to the aims of the organization that you're working within. And there are like schools of dramatic training that do similar things to people, although for different purposes. Like the idea that you would semi-voluntarily undergo this radical remaking of yourself for goals which are not like 100% your own. Yeah.
So I think that's something that Cyberpunk was right about, is that the concern for the will of organizations overriding the will of the individuals. There was an organization called the Critical Art Ensemble that did a series of interesting investigations that talked about the way that their concern was the state at the time, the way that the state would be able to perform ever more intimate investigations into the human body more often, and that this would become, and that the barrier for where constant surveillance would move from being outside in the society until eventually it was on the inside of your body, like it would pass through the skin layer to inside you somehow. So I think in that sense that Gibson was right, that there is a disturbing trend there.
And you know, there are companies currently existing which sell themselves on the basis that constantly being aware of your own biometric data will somehow optimize you in some direction.
Yeah, well, I've got one.
Yeah.
So despite my concerns, I'm still, selling all my corporate data unwillingly to HQ.
And I mean, to come back to my idea about corporate incompetence, or at the very least, kind of failure to serve its supposed customer. I read an article quite recently, which I attempted to dig up for this, but I couldn't remember enough about its title or its author to find it quickly. But it was by this woman who has one of these reasonably high-tech prosthetic legs, one of the ones that stabilizes itself and all of that kind of stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And in the course of reading the article, I was reminded of the fact that I have a friend here in Palmerston North who has one of those hearing aids that is actually drilled into your skull. I'm not sure of the exact mechanics of that, or which bit of it sits inside your head, because he's also got a bit that sits inside his ear that comes out of it. But that's kind of beside the point. But what this woman was talking about in her article was that her leg is a proprietary model that comes from a particular company, and therefore it's dependent on firmware updates and part compatibility and all of that kind of stuff in order to keep working. And because it's a necessary part of her continued full functionality, like a human with one leg is less functional than a human with two. Similarly, my friend would be less functional if his hearing aid stopped working. She is, to some degree, permanently dependent on this architecture of patches and firmware updates. And for a non-disability related example, at my work, we use instead of analog sound discs in a radio station, we use a system made by a company called Wheatstone, which is distributed network audio. So what happens is that all of your audio goes into these essentially rack-mounted computers called blades, and the actual sound discs are just control interfaces for the blade. At the upside of that is that any piece of audio that goes into that system is available anywhere else in that system. So if you're clever, you can set up a bunch of presets. So if someone's talking in the on-air studio, you can have it show up in a different studio, and you can do all of this clever stuff with that. It's very cool. The downside is that Wheatstone is its own corporate entity with its own proprietary software and firmware and all of that stuff. And a recent Windows 10 update, because our IT people insisted that we are on Windows for 1 and that we keep our Windows installs updated for 2 in order to make their jobs easier for corporate reasons too boring to go into.
Sure.
We got a Windows update numbered Windows Update 2004, which completely destroys the ability of the computer to communicate with the Wheatstone system. And so we are now in a situation where we have like a separate third-party sound card on the affected computer, because we caught it on all of the other ones, but one of the computers we were too late to save. Wow. So the sound comes out of this flash system into another little box and then back into the flash system again, just so that the computer doesn't have to talk to it directly or else it'll freak out. And there are people who are in that situation essentially like with their limbs or their ability to hear. I think that corporate shaping of human functionality is interesting and kind of scary.
If you don't mind disclosing, do you mind if I ask if Wheatstone is a service that you rent or a product that you buy? Now, this is not me prevaricating because I don't want to tell you. This is me literally trying to remember. I think that because we in particular are a charity, they did us a deal on the Wheatstone system, but I think it is one of these situations where after a certain point you might pay for continued updates, or like you pay for a set of versions and then you're good till the next. Like the digital audio workstation I use, which works on a very good model, I think, because it's much less critical to my survival. But the way that I use Reaper, and Reaper, you pay, I think it's $60 US, and you get a set number of version updates. I think you get like 4 or 5 full version updates worth of updates, and then you have to pay it again. Right. And I think Wheatstone might be something like that. Yeah, the whole software as a service thing that is coming in, so you're just constantly paying. A good example is that the program that I use to place this panel behind me, I got a 3-month free trial to that when I bought this camera. But anyway, that's slightly off topic. I think that you've isolated, in talking about your friend's legs firmware updates, you've isolated what Cyberpunk's strength is, which is that it uses what is most visible to make a point about something, about the situation that humanity is in, which is, it's not always obvious to us that actually all of our lives are constantly dependent on this massive infrastructure of, suppose there was a firmware problem with oil tanker navigation systems tomorrow, we would all be, would make this so-called pandemic into, a backstory.
For all that he has recently fallen from grace, I would recommend a book by Warren Ellis called Normal, which again is a novella, so it's a nice, short, easy read. The central thing of it is it's a murder mystery, but it's a murder mystery set at a retreat called Normal Head, which is where governments and very powerful corporations send people who are suffering from a malaise known as abyss gaze. So what happens is that there are people whose job is to spend all day thinking about what happens if the firmware on all of the oil tankers fails at once. And doing that too long gives you a touch of abyss gaze, and then you have to go to Normal Head so that you can straighten out and stop yelling at strangers in the street. That, like, one of the characters that the main person meets yells at him about how there's this complicated series of pumps that needs to be in permanent operation all of the time, or New York will drown on its own shit. Because there's no, like, the only way that that system will work is with constant propelled outflow, because it was not built with sewerage. And if that ever fails, then it will fail catastrophically.
Yeah. It makes one nervous to think that there are nuclear power plants that still run on Fortran and COBOL and designed in the pre-internet age, and they've had their sort of internet connectivity slapped on in the kind of 80s, and then who knows who's responsible for upgrading those or not, presumably someone. But it's just so funny that there's so many interrelated systems that we rely on that are all kind of mutually dependent.
Yeah, and I mean, if you want to do the trick of comparing human bodies to computer systems, there are if you have a Windows computer, there are files that you can go and find which are part of the original architecture of Windows 3, I believe. There may be some which go all the way back to DOS. And because they're built on top and built on top and built on top, these files just never went away. Similarly, one of my pleasant Twitter experiences is I was reading a thread from a guy I respect the content of, and he was talking about how he'd made a small breakthrough with his therapist, when his therapist had pointed out to him that some of the stuff that he experienced as emotional distress was his body doing a poor job of communicating signals to him about its immediate needs. And so he was saying in his particular case, a sense of overwhelming existential dread about the future of him personally and the human race can be solved in 50 to 80% of cases by a large glass of water.
Wow.
And that in retrospect, it was perhaps a mistake to build, human OS on top of Ape OS, which was built on top of Monkey OS. There are probably some subroutines in there that are doing some stuff that's not super useful.
Well, as far as I'm aware, there's no way to get rid of them. I'm told that sitting in a cave and thinking about nothing for a long time can help with the management of the problem, but I don't know if that really is a permanent solution for any of us living in the first world full time.
No, and in fact, I used to record 1.5 hour lecture on Chan Buddhism, which is like the Chinese equivalent of Zen, a week for my job. So, and because of the way the recordings worked, it couldn't be set and forget. I had to sit and listen to it every single week. And one of the kind of illustrative stories that this nun told was about a student who comes to his master and says, "Master, we're liberating ourselves from the chains of desire and being, and we will achieve the perfect state of Buddha nature. These peasants who we're just teaching to chant the name of Buddha, that's not going to do that for them. So why are we doing that? That seems like we're cheating them." And the master says, I'm paraphrasing heavily here, but the world will only support so many monks. You have to have the peasants and the money lenders and the merchants and everybody do all of their jobs in order for us to release ourselves from the chains of desire and detach ourselves from the world and fly off into the infinite. And so it's necessary to teach them this debased form so that they can get a better step up on the ladder in their next life, and eventually they will get to be a monk and detach themselves and fly up into the air. But, you know, like sitting in the cave and meditating on nothingness has, even at its inception, not been a solution for everyone.
That's right. All right, let me pull on another thread. Due to the inheritance of Philip K. Dick's style of science fiction, there's always been this obsession with the person-robot dichotomy and this idea, and we see it in Blade Runner really strongly, this idea that we don't always know who the robot is. And I think that makes a type of dissent. Before, when I was talking about how we can have machines inside our body, and that's got a certain kind of something uncomfortable about it. It would be easy to think that it had come from a state of, you know, small things in the body, just in terms of the development of the genre, and then it comes into the state of having lots of stuff in your body. But actually, it seems to come from the other way around. We have the whole robot, the whole human being as a robot, and it comes down to the state of having lots of machines inside your body. Do you have a perspective on what Philip K. Dick's concern was, that he was so concerned about whether the human is a robot or not?
Well, so I've read a few of Philip K. Dick's novels, and firstly, I would, if there are any young and impressionable people listening who have a taste for mind-altering substances, I would strongly advise laying off the mind-altering substances while you're interacting with Philip K. Dick and vice versa, because the thing about Philip K. Dick is he's very seductive in the way that, like, Hunter S. Thompson is very seductive. It's very easy to find yourself on his wavelength, and his wavelength is incredibly paranoid. And so you can will yourself into a very strange space with Philip K. Dick. Because I think the thing with Philip K. Dick is that the concern about, in Blade Runner, the concern about who's a robot and who's not is, from my memory, a stronger part of Blade Runner than it is a part of Do Androids Dream of Electric Sheep, I think. Because it was easier to demonstrate how visually similar Harrison Ford is to the people that he's hunting down, because they're clearly people, and they fight and bleed and try to survive like people, and they keep coming back to that. With Dick, there's a concern that that reality is not as it should be, and that has to be the result of a lie somewhere, and the paranoia comes from an inability to precisely place where the lie is and who's telling it, so that everyone becomes suspect. So I guess to relate it to conversations about magic, it's about the awareness that perception can be controlled, leading to a concern that it's hard to tell if your perception is being controlled. Would be one way of thinking about it.
There are some theorists in the early 20th century, after the Second World War, who were worried that society was somehow going to robotize humanity. So we would come to a point where we had people in our society who weren't human but didn't know that they weren't human, and that there's a possibility that slowly that would happen to everybody, and then what was human would have disappeared. And and there was some fears about that, but I haven't read enough about it to really offer a perspective on it.
You could certainly see that as being related to the same sorts of strains of thought, although Marx's earlier, but that gave rise to Marx. Like Marx was looking at the transition from serfdom to industrial, early industrial laboring, and which means he was thinking about like children being eaten by mechanized looms and stuff like that. And I could see the omnipresence of that kind of industry, which is very like messily and physically destructive of people and requires people to be as machine-like as possible. Like the way that children avoid getting eaten by the loom is by getting really good at timing what they're doing with the movements of the loom and working in sync with the machine, which is driven by a steam engine. So it's like completely regular, and steam engines are not great at varying speed. So it's regular and invariable.
Interesting. I read a play once. It might have been Antonin Artaud, I'm not sure. But anyway, there was a guy who... the play was very much about men who work with machines and how proud they are to be part of the machine, and all covered in black coal dust with these big hammers saying, "I'm part of the machine, we're steel men." And I was I think it was in the early USSR that it came about. But yeah, there's a very large and sophisticated analysis of what the relationship between the machine and the human is.
Yeah, well, I mean, a couple of times in a couple of conversations, I've heard you make this comment that at the same time as humans shape tools shape humans, and vice versa, backwards and forwards constantly. And I think you can extend that back to things like William Burroughs saying that language is a virus. Like language is a thing that's got into our heads and found that being useful is a really good way to propagate itself. And humans who can coordinate do better than humans who can't. So language becomes indispensable. And now we develop all of our writing forms so that we have ways of preserving language outside of a single human mind. We're building the virus eggs for itself, if you like. And I think you can certainly think of language and philosophical concepts as technology, in that sense that shape humans back and forth and are shaped by them in that way. So I mean, I guess where I'm going is that I feel like that process is kind of an inescapable part of the human condition. One of the things that makes us human is that oh shit, so I'm reading my kids the Sword in the Stone, and I meant to grab it because there's a bit in the Sword in the Stone where the wart is made privy to the creation of all of the animals by God. God gets all of the animals who come to him as embryos, so they all look more or less identical, and he says, "I'm going to give each of you whatever gift you want. You can have like anything that you can think of. I will make it part of you, and you will be that way forever." And so the badger says, "I want both of my hands to be spades and my jaws to be a vice grip that is impossible to unlock. All of the birds ask for wings. All of the fish ask to spend their lives in water." And then eventually it comes round to the human, and the human says, "If it would please you, I think I would like to stay as I am. And if I want a spade, I'll make a spade. And if I want a boat, I'll make a boat. And if I want to fly, I'll build an aeroplane." And because this is T.H. White, God is fabulously pleased with this and declares the humans to have passed the test and won. But it does go back that far, I feel like. we are the species where if some of us cannot see, we figure out a way to put little bits of glass in a special frame and balance them on the ends of their noses. Yeah. And that's now like a thing that's so ubiquitous that it's kind of a cultural signifier more than a thing that would make you think about someone's ability or disability.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I've said it before and I'll say it again. I definitely feel like the human and the machine are so interrelated that there's no way to separate them. And if you tried to go back to a time where there wasn't a machine, you would find yourself in a place where there wasn't a human either. Yeah.
Because I think you can make a plausible case that the first point at which you see something that you would say is at least proto-human is when you're now Michael Pollan, who I mentioned before, says that it starts when we start cooking, which is a technology to do a good portion of the hard work of chewing and digesting on the outside of our bodies communally. Because it means that whatever you're eating, you get a lot more out of a lot less. But if you wanted to be more traditionally archaeological about it, you would say it's the point where you can see someone, banging on a rock with another rock to make a sharp edge, because a sharp edge is always a useful thing to have.
Yeah. So if we interpret what the human being is as the sort of nexus point of a collection of these sort of intersubjective relationships of the human and the machine, the language and the world, I think we can interpret each of the major pieces of the canon of cyberculture as being a negotiation about that. So Blade Runner is something like... Yep.
I was going to say there is another level as well, which is that the humans. My metaphor is always we are. If you're looking at like sheep are herd animals, dogs are pack animals, apes by and large are troop animals. So primates as a group, there are some exceptions like orangutans, but as a rule, primates are animals that thrive in a large-ish, socially cohesive group where there's a strong element of mutual support and also some degree of recognized social hierarchy, which is manipulated by a certain amount of interpersonal game playing. So I feel like the other component is always that there is a tension or a dynamic between a self-aware individual and that individual's participation in a series of organizations or collectives, because I don't think that it's possible to be a human and survive without those. I think even the most hermitous human requires at least the products of a society in order to continue to function.
Even a human being who exits entirely from everything of the human world is still a product of the human world, and there's no getting around that.
And if they're going to persist in their existence, then they will almost certainly require as much continued interaction with the human world as is necessary to procure the tools that they need for their survival, because there is always the relationship with the machine.
Okay, so going back to my earlier suggestion that each of the parts of the cyberpunk canon are a elucidation of one of these relationships. We can say that Blade Runner is elucidating the relationship between the human being and the fear that other people are only pretending to be human beings and aren't really, and so it's some sort of like paranoia of the social relationship.
And it's also to some degree a contest between the individual and the organization, in the sense that the self-aware human-like machines are attempting to negotiate with their creator, which is a physically and temporally existing human organization. Like it's a corporation with a human that leads it.
Yeah, so it says something about the relationship between man and God, right? Like, how do you confront your creator? Yep. And then Neuromancer elucidates the relationship between man and technology, and especially man and the corporation, you know, and what to do about human freedom when you live in a world where there are these Zaibatsu that, powered by AI, might as well be gods at that point.
Yeah, and I think you can take a magical perspective and make a case that sufficiently large and public-facing organizations are becoming egregorish, separate to their human components. Like, I would not be surprised to discover a chaos magician invoking Mario, because Mario is a sufficiently defined and culturally embedded figure that you could say, I want this specific aspect that only this entity can grant me access to, and this is the easiest portal into that into that entity space that I can find from my mind right now.
Well, I heard a story, and I'm not sure if this is true, but I heard that the reason why Mario grows when he eats a mushroom is because a stray cosmic ray caused a bit flip in one of the programs that was going while it was being made, and the person who designed it enjoyed it. So for the Chaos Magician that wants purely random and incapable of comprehension chance to favour things for them, that would be the right route.
Yeah.
And then Ghost in the Shell seems like the relationship between the individual and the state, and specifically shadow organisations in the state, and making the moral case that organisations that operate under the control of the state but outside of the control of the democratic process are necessary, and if you want to live in a highly technological world, you have to accept the existence of those, and as a citizen you are morally bound up in that occurring.
Yes. Yeah, I think so, because it's you have to, as a New Zealand citizen, even though you don't get direct say in their decisions, you do have to be morally culpable. I don't know if culpable is the right word, but like, we own the SIS, and whatever they do on our behalf, even though we don't know what it is that they do. And often they do it for reasons which are inscrutable or driven by agendas which fit with like specific individuals within the architecture rather than the goals of the organization itself. Because that's a thing that whatever section they are, that Major Kusanagi's team come into conflict with.
9.
That, your Section 9 is they have to contend not only with terrorists, but there are people with individual specific agendas as well.
I'm trying to think if there's any other like core cyberpunk canon bits that fit this mold.
Well, so I mean, the other part of the Blade Runner paranoia is a fundamental questioning of the condition of personhood. Like, specifically with Blade Runner, the central thing that haunted film fans forever was like, is Deckard a replicant? And that's a thing that Blade Runner 2049 completely sidesteps. even though they bring back Harrison Ford and he's in it as Deckard, they steadfastly refuse to ever answer that question, even though they straight up tell you that the main character is a replicant from A Standing Start. And that carries across into Ghost in the Shell, because there are all of those questions about if your memories can be altered because your mind is essentially accessible as code, then how do you define your personhood? And to spoil a nearly 40-year-old manga, because I think Ghost in the Shell came out in like 81 or something like that originally. I forget exactly when, but like the manga's quite old. I've got it in a tab. Let me find it.
Yeah, I know the movie came out in 96.
Yeah, so it starts in 1989, but still, like that's quite old. At the end of the manga and the 1996 movie, Major Kusanagi merges her personality with a completely synthetic personality. So she's a human who had a debilitating accident at a young age and had her entire body replaced. But the thing that she merges with is an emergent entity that became self-aware on the web. And they have like a pages-long debate about what will happen and in what way this thing that calls itself the Puppet Master can call itself an entity. So that was clearly a thing that was occupying some brain space for Shiro.
And what a phenomenal achievement that manga is, by the way. It still holds up to this day. I read it again recently, and I was like, it actually still feels futuristic all this time later.
It's great. It's futuristic. It does that thing that Robert Crumb does and Jonan Vasquez does as well, like being so enthusiastic about what you're talking about, or unable to not make jokes about yourself, that like it'll make a point subtly in a page, and then it will like expand on that in the white space between the panels for another half a page. Just this tiny little notes. But it's also such lightning in a bottle, because if you look at Masamune Shiro's other work, the majority of it is just porn about really shiny women.
Yeah.
Like he did this one earth-shatteringly insightful, kind of timeless book, and then just made a lot of pictures of shiny women on bicycles sweating a lot.
Very Vaseline-y.
Yeah.
I have thought about why that was, and I had assumed on no basis that he was a genius who put everything that he had into a single book and then was hammered into place by the forces of the market, and the market demands nothing except Vaseline-covered tits.
Yeah, now I have not done any research into this, but I would not be surprised if that was the case, and I would not be surprised if that was the case on the basis of Neon Genesis Evangelion, which... Do you know the backstory of Evangelion?
I don't.
Okay, so the meta story about Evangelion is it was created because Hideaki Anno, the guy, the central guy, had demonstrated some promise at Gainax, and basically Gainax said, okay, you can do whatever you want, but make it toyetic, like make it marketable in some way. And so he created Neon Genesis Evangelion basically on the fly. Like, he was writing it very much as they were animating it. And the first half of the series is pretty much a standard giant robot anime for the time. Like, it's got a bit more focus on the lives of its characters, but Gundam had already done the, like, these robots needed to be piloted by teenagers for reasons so that they can have teenage drama thing already. And the driving force of it was like the sale of figurines and the enormous popularity of the two female Ava pilots, Ray and Asuka, and the fan debate over who was best waifu, essentially.
Okay.
And so about halfway through the series, there is the notorious flip where it suddenly becomes intensely about the internal lives of the pilots and basically becomes like it's a 26 episode series and the last 13 episodes are a prolonged anxiety attack. And it finished with this weird psychedelic end of the world that happens over 2 episodes and was delivered in a very abstract way. Partly because the original plan was too close to the sarin attacks on the Tokyo subway. So they had to re-script and rewrite a whole bunch of stuff late in the piece, but also because Hideaki Anno had begun to suffer really severe mental health problems. And one of the things that he was becoming really disillusioned with was the fan culture around his own show. So he delivers these very abstract last 2 episodes, and the fans fucking hated it. They threatened to burn down the studio. They sent him death threats. There was just this enormous rage about how could you end the series like this. And so he rallied with Gainax and produced End of Evangelion, which is a movie which you could see as a replacement of or an alternate retelling of the final 2 episodes of the series, but where everyone is their absolute worst selves in a way which is like a direct critique on the demands that he'd been getting from fans. Like, you want this character to be more sexy? Okay, well, I'm going to have her in a coma with her tits out and the main character's going to wank on her.
Oh, my God.
That's in the first 10 minutes. And it has an incredibly graphic and explicit end of the world, which comes to a conclusion which is very uncomplimentary about human nature and the central flaws of its protagonist, who was very much like your standard like shonen anime, like this is your person to insert yourself into the space of, like blank space protagonist to start with. He comes off looking like a really bad person by the end. And so there is definitely a sense, this is where I was going with this, that like the fan culture within Japan, particularly the like pornier, pervier edge of that fan culture, can exert a really strong pressure on creators through corporate means. And
so it is plausible then that Masamune Shirow was forced
into a life of
to become a pornographer.
That wouldn't surprise me. They're outside of the porn space, the schedule for people who write manga is notoriously incredibly demanding. And so there are a number of series which have come to like abrupt and strange ends because essentially the creator was just burned out and couldn't function anymore. That particular corporate structure is very strange and destructive.
Well, the other thing that's interesting about, pretty much Ghost in the Shell is the only manga that I've really ever watched, or whatever you call it, anime, I suppose. But I find it amazing that it's one of those shows that has successfully held up across the standalone complex and the various movies that have come after it and that kind of thing, which is, maybe they don't quite have just the sheer genius of the first one, but still, it's been carried.
I think it has, and I think, one of the central things, if you go and look up Cyberpunk on Wikipedia, is they talk about high-tech, low culture, and one of the things that Ghost in the Shell really did well is give you a sense of feeling like you're hanging out with a group of real people who have lives and concerns, and you get to watch them go to rubbish bars and eat shitty junk food and go to flash restaurants because they're trying to impress someone, and like have dumb arguments with their boss, and like there's and particularly in the 1996 movie, there are all of these shots of the city just used as kind of mood setting in between the stuff that's happening that give you a real sense of this like crowded but very alive and very bustling and very very inhabited place.
Yeah, with the 96 movie, when it shows you what the low end of the city looks like, it really does take the time to like position it and make sure that you understand that that's actually what's going on and what the lives of regular citizens is like at that point. Whereas I find other shows, among their weaknesses, can be just skipping all of that in order to stick to the shiny bits.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's, and this is very much stretching the far edges of what you could call cyberpunk, but thinking about anime, that's the thing that really appeals to me about Cowboy Bebop as well, is that you get to see these people live on a spaceship eating like shitty noodles because they can't afford anything else because every single one of their jobs goes wrong. And very much the bounties they end up pursuing are like people doing bad things for bad reasons for very low stakes. And everywhere they go, everyone's life is like that, you know. It's very much that thing. Mentioning Evangelion actually reminded me of another thing, which we're probably running a little long, but I've
got all the time to talk about this, so
wonderful.
Tell me when your battery runs out, and that's when we'll quit it. Yeah.
So the thing it reminded me of is that there is another recurring thing that does come up, which is the concept of some sort of environmental collapse. And so the thing about Neon Genesis Evangelion is that it's set, as I say, in 2016, but in the world of the show, there was this explosion in Antarctica, which is called the Second Impact, which happened back in the year 2000, I think, in their alternate timeline. And that destroyed Antarctica and flooded the world. And like, I don't know, I think 2/3 of the human population died, and now they're under attack by space aliens, and they need teenagers and robots to fight them off.
Right.
But the thing that causes that I found haunting, because I watched like the first 3 or 4 episodes of Neon Genesis Evangelion in 1998 on a DVD that a mutual friend of ours owned, and then it was notoriously impossible to track down, so I never saw the rest of it until Netflix released it. And so I actually finished watching it last year, and the thing that was haunting watching the rest of it in 2020 is that because of the Second Impact, the world's weather has permanently altered. It is always bakingly hot and sunny, and there are always cicadas on the soundtrack outside, like that real kind of deafening hot day, cicadas everywhere outside, and it gets louder and louder and louder as the series goes on. And living with the consciousness of a changing climate, watching this character have an existential breakdown or a series of existential breakdowns in this world which is just always bakingly hot and flooded with these cicadas just getting louder and louder and louder every time they're outside. It was like a thing that Hideaki Anno could not have predicted would freak me out, but made me feel like quite weird and spooky watching it in 2020.
Yeah, because if cicadas in the summer really can become offensively loud, like a real imposition, like you have to shout over them to talk to your friends. It's like rain on a corrugated iron roof or something like that, or hail. Yeah. And yeah, so in terms of like the growing background radiation of the potential of disaster of climate change.
Yeah. And I mean,
it fits.
That's not what he thought he was talking about. He was like, let's get this thing that's part of this particular apocalypse that I've created for my own reasons. And I'm just going to turn the temperature up on people losing their shit for a variety of reasons. But inadvertently, he created this thing which feels very ominous now.
All right. Let me ask you, what was the most recent successful cyberpunk media that you experienced?
So the thing that I watched for pure dumb joy that was successful cyberpunk, even though it has magic in place of science, is the anime of a manga called Dorohedoro, which is about it's about a man with a lizard's head whose name is Kaiman. He was cursed by a sorcerer to have a lizard's head, and he's trying to find the sorcerer who did it and make them change him back. And he doesn't remember anything about before he was a lizard, and he's really good at cutting people up with knives. But the setting is that there's this rundown shithole of a place called Hole, which is where the humans live, and the sorcerers come there from another world through magic doors and do magic to people to practice being better at magic, and then go away again. And so Hole is full of these people who've had their bodies warped by magical experiments. There are like bug people and people with weird fangs and all kinds of stuff. And the thing that I really enjoyed about it is it's in between all of the stuff that actually progresses the plot. It's just about these people living and working in this awful place and supporting one another. And the aesthetic of it is very cyberpunk in the sense that like there's a lot of buckles and biker jackets and people wearing gas masks for no real reason and all that kind of stuff.
Sure.
And it's a lot of fun. The thing that I read that I found very effective cyberpunk was most recently 2 books by Cory Doctorow. So there was the one that I mentioned, which is the collection of novellas called Radicalized. So that's got 4 books in it, 3 of which are good and 1 of which is all right, which is, not bad for...
That's pretty good ratio.
Yeah. So the TLDRs of all of them are, or the setups for all of them are, Radicalized is about a person whose wife gets cancer and then discovers that the support group that he's joined to help him deal with living with his wife who has cancer is becoming a terrorist organization aimed at attacking insurance companies. And the ways in which he deals with that. Unauthorized Bread is the one that I talked about before, which is a woman who becomes a hacker initially because her oven stops working because the company that provides the firmware gets like asset stripped by another company and goes out of business and can no longer provide updates. There's one, the last one in it that's good is called The Mask of the Red Death, which is about, this thing where billionaires are buying bunkers in Central Otago and places like that because they've decided they're going to like work out when the event is and ride it out there.
I've heard the rumors, but I've never been able to confirm.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know if it's actually happening either, but there is definitely a sense that that's what people are doing. The Mask of the Red Death follows a guy who sets up a bunker like that, and spoilers, but everything slowly goes wrong on the inside, while on the outside everything immediately goes wrong, but then people collectively work out how to survive. And the paranoia of the bunker people means that they never get any of the benefits of everybody else learning how to live in the world that actually exists now.
Nice. That's a great. That's great. I like that. I'm sure that I've read some Cory Doctorow, but I couldn't tell you now which one it was.
Yeah, he wrote a book with a guy called Charles Stross. So Charles Stross wrote a series called The Laundry Books, which are about the secret British government department whose job is to fight Cthulhu monsters. They're quite good kind of comedy science fantasy kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But he collaborated with Cory Doctorow on a book called The Rapture of the Nerds, which is about the technological singularity, and how people deal with the fact that most people are now like uploading themselves into the cloud so they can live their life as like an animated breakfast.
Sure.
The other Cory Doctorow book that I read that I really liked is a longer novel called Walkaway, and that is set in a near future which is post-work and post-scarcity. So humans have figured out how to make stuff out of nanomachines, but also we've had a climate crisis, so much of the world is unlivable, and the gap between rich and poor is accelerated to the point where you have like normal people who don't actually need to work, but whose lives are nothing special, and like god kings. So there's like a sequence quite early in the book where a character, he's just made a new friend, and her dad insists on picking them up from where they are. And her dad is one of these, they're called Zotta rich people. And everyone moves around in self-driving ride shares. That's just the standard form of transport. Sure. But he has a personal car, which is very unusual. And the way that it works is that his AI in his personal car is set like 50% more aggressively than everybody else's. But because all of the ride shares are designed to mitigate risk, what'll happen is they'll see his car driving really aggressively and they'll just get out of the way of it so as not to cause an accident. And he gets anywhere he wants to go, like 50% again faster than anybody else can. And of course, this is highly illegal, and he racks up an enormous amount of traffic fines. But because he's so rich that money is fundamentally meaningless to him, it just means that like there's a point of wealth past which law is meaningless, and you can do whatever you want. But the actual meat of the story is about the walkaways, who are people who opt out of that society and wander off into the polluted and climate changed wasteland and start all of these incredibly diverse communes, because it's post-scarcity, so you can take a building seed with you if you can steal it from somewhere and plant it in the ground, and it'll build itself a building. And then you have the opportunity to start your own little like pocket society that has whatever rules you think might work. So there are all of these tiny experimental societies all over the place that operate by different rules and like trade with one another because they might have different resources that they're sucking out of the ground that make their replicators work better or whatever.
So does it function as a tour of Cory Doctorow's imagination of varieties of post-scarcity existence?
It does that, and then it deals with the way that those societies have to then fight back when the state that everybody else exists within begins to find them intolerable. And that includes when members of their party are murdered or abducted for political reasons, creating virtual copies of those people so that they still have them as like a resource to help them strategize and plan. And so it gets like headier and stranger as it goes along. There's the concept of a couple who were like inseparable as humans, but then one of them gets murdered and the other one gets abducted, and so they both get virtual copies of themselves brought online, and the virtual copies hate one another for reasons which are never fully understood. They both don't get on. But the woman who's abducted is then retrieved an enormous amount of time later and brought back into the fold, and she kind of gets on with both, and they have this like slightly awkward triangular relationship. And he gets into things like the idea of, because everyone is networked and connected, there's a last stand where they're besieged by the forces of the financial state, and there's all of this like tactical doxing of the soldiers who are participating in the siege, so that they can be linked up with their families who will tell them about, like, we don't approve of what you're doing, you should leave these people alone, they're not hurting anyone. And like it starts causing waves of mass desertion. So it gets, very it does a lot of things all at once.
Fantastic. I mean, it's nice to know that the genre is still continuing, because to me it does kind of feel over.
I certainly think that the initial wave, like the people with obvious robot bits and lenses for eyeballs, and jacking your brain into the internet, which is a like virtual space that you fly around, that bit is probably over. But I think there are people who are continuing to take that approach to the philosophy of it, and the high-tech low lives, and the marriage of near future slightly speculative technology and noir. Because the other thing that Charles Stross did is he wrote 2 novels. One of them's called Rule 34, and I can't remember what the other one's called, but they're both about a Scottish police department in the near future investigating like murders of internet scammers, and there's like AI weirdness and stuff involved, but like they end up busting things which are like there's some sort of limited replicator technology and someone is selling the instructions for a prohibited kind of sex doll that you could grow in your own bathtub and then on-sell to unscrupulous people. And so there's that kind of stuff, but it's all very it's near future police procedural.
Sure. Black Mirror?
I liked the first season of Black Mirror. I feel like Black Mirror has a risk of just sliding into cell phone bad.
Charlie Brooker is always just a little too negative for my tastes.
Yeah, and so I think the thing that when Black Mirror works for me, it's when the central conceit of an episode is really, really clever. Like the idea of a woman who is able to resurrect a golem of her ex-husband from his social media posts. The idea that the idea of making mob cancellation lethal as a sort of pointed practical joke. The accidentally prophetic thing about getting the Prime Minister of England to fuck a pig.
Oops. They hyperstitioned that one.
Yeah. I do feel like as he went on and got thinner on ideas and became more negative, it got less good. But I think the good bits of it are very good. Yeah.
But is it cyberpunk?
It's certainly cyberpunk adjacent, because it's always about how people live their lives in relation to a particular kind of technological future. But I think it varies in terms of how cyberpunk it is from episode to episode, because even though the concern is always the kind of social science fiction concern, like he never much cares exactly how the technology works, and I think that's a good thing.
Yeah.
He cares how people live with it, but sometimes there are ordinary people living ordinary lives who either make use of a particular technology or have their lives interrupted by it, but sometimes it's like everyone wears a jumpsuit and lives in a vast complex underground which is powered by hundreds of people riding exocycles, and that's more kind of 1984
yeah. It's just
vast,
a straight dystopia at that point.
Vast alternate future kind of thing than Cyberpunk, I think.
Was there a show called Lost Carbon that was quite a little bit?
Oh, Altered Carbon.
Altered Carbon.
Yeah.
Is Altered Carbon Cyberpunk?
I think Altered Carbon is Cyberpunk. I have only watched like an episode of Altered Carbon. But the things about that one episode that I watched that would make me say that it was Cyberpunk is that it is concerned with the continuity of identity unrelated to the physical continuity of body. So a central conceit of the setting is that humans have these little like digital plug thingies that replace one of their top vertebrae, which just backs up their entire personality, which means that you can take one out and slot it into a new body, and then you are just you, but your body is different. Which, people will argue about whether that's a feasible concept or not, but that's how it is in that setting. And the other thing there's a thing that happens in that first episode that makes me think of it as Cyberpunk, which is there's a point where the main character is pursued into, it's like an obsolete theme hotel, where like the in-universe explanation is like 20 or 30 years ago there was a vogue for these hotels where everything is automated and there are like holographic concierges to provide the illusion that you're interacting with a person, but it's kind of the spirit of the place of the hotel just manifesting in all of these different places as a hologram. And he's being chased by people who want to kill him, and he comes into one of these hotels, which immediately threatens him with its emplaced miniguns, because of course it has emplaced miniguns. And he says, I want a room, which means that he's now a guest. So it's the hotel's duty to protect him. So when the guys who are chasing him burst in through the door, they get shot by the emplaced miniguns, because it's the hotel's duty of care to protect its guest. And that kind of like invoking of a corporate relationship, which has these like immediate lethal physical consequences. And that's just kind of an accepted thing that you can do. Struck me as a very cyberpunk conception.
Yeah, I think you're right. I can't really recommend the show. I watched it and it was good for a little while, and then had a pretty stern, the plane flew into the mountain.
Right.
Yeah.
I mean, part of my affection for it in that first episode, which, as I said, wasn't strong enough to keep me watching the rest, was that I quite enjoyed the American version of the Scandinavian detective show, The Killing. So I can't remember what it's called in the Scandinavian version. It's just a standard Scandi noir murder thing, except that it's like a really awful crime done for really, really dumb reasons, and it does that thing where all of the people you meet are somehow implicated and they could be guilty, and the person who turns out to be guilty is an ordinary person who did something really bad for something where you can't quite sympathize, but you can understand why they would do it. But anyway, the central guy from Altered Carbon is the lead detective's kind of sidekick in that. Gotcha. And I was quite taken with him in that show, and then I saw Altered Carbon and I was like, oh, it's that guy, I'll give this an episode, and then I never quite followed through.
Gotcha. All right, well, do you think that cyberpunk can continue as a genre? Like, is this a situation where cyberpunk has run out of ground, and if there is going to be cyberpunk in the future, there needs to be a cyberpunk 2? Or is it that it just needs a revitalization to re-understand the central concerns of cyberpunk in a new body?
Yeah, I think the second one, because I mean, Radicalized came out in 2019, I want to say, and Walkaway maybe in 2017. Rapture of the Nerds was like 2011, 2012, something like that. So those are all reasonably recent, and I would call them solidly cyberpunk in terms of their philosophy and their concerns. But I do think that it needs a shift away. Like, I think it's very easy to be taken with the very striking visual design of 1980s cyberpunk and feel like that is the thing that is cyberpunk. And I think a lot of the criticisms, aside from apparently it's also very ropily held together, but a lot of the artistic criticisms rather than the functional criticisms of the newest cyberpunk game that I have seen, I haven't played it, but have been around that concern that it's a lot of like funny shaped sunglasses and odd haircuts and people with shiny metal arms, but it's not as aware of what was motivating all of those things.
Yeah, I've played some of it, and the thing that offended me most about it was that everybody was full of chrome.
Right. Yeah.
When I go to the dairy in Cyberpunk World, I expect to find someone who can't afford chrome, not a guy who has, 3 cybernetic limbs and a level 5 netbook in his head or whatever. Yeah. So yes, there was that, but at the level of the plot line, actually, a lot of the kind of stuff that is in it is strictly concerned with genuine cyberpunk concerns and follows it that way. But yeah, if I had to choose between a future of the genre which took the philosophical concerns seriously or had the cool aesthetic, I know which one of those two I'd rather have, although obviously having both would be ideal.
Yeah, and I think the aesthetics are a product of the era in which the first works were created. The metal limbs are a way in which prosthetics seemed sort of stretched to be plausible in the 1980s. Networked computing was just beginning to be a thing that could sort of work. So Neuromancer's version of the internet is kind of a stretch from there. And what you find with Walkaway and with Rapture of the Nerds is that the magic technology du jour is we've decided that nanomachines work.
Right.
And so that's what gives us our post-scarcity and our ability to upload ourselves into the cloud if we want to, is that it is possible to have a swarm of tiny machines absorb you and digitize you as they do it. And they can make anything out of anything else given enough energy, which we can collect in various ways.
Right.
And I mean, there's always a certain amount of hand wavium involved, but that's where the kind of like the technology comes in, because I think that at the time, like nanotechnology and networked computing seemed like more the thing that was going to do that. In Charles Stross's stuff, it's much more around like 3D printers being projected into a much more advanced form, and sort of like self-building machines that work on the same principle as a 3D printer. So like you dump your seed in a bunch of the appropriate feedstock in the bathtub and it grows a sex doll overnight.
Right.
If you see what I mean. So it's not a total like nanomachine replicator thing, but it's more like the way that 3D printers work. And a lot of stuff is around the way that mobile communications work. So lots of mobile networky stuff.
Yeah. I'd be interested in seeing a cyberpunk genre or an attempt inside the cyberpunk genre to take biotechnology seriously. Mostly because I don't know enough about biotechnology, and I could regard it as a learning experience.
Yeah, no, that's not a thing that I've seen. The only science fiction thing I've read that had much to do with biotechnology was not actually about it. It was just sort of a feature of the setting. It's a book called Embassy Town by China Miéville, which is about the idea that in the far future, humanity has established contact with a race of aliens who have an entirely different language form. So they can only understand if two voices speak at once, and they can't talk about anything that doesn't actually exist. So in order to have metaphors, they have to go and make a thing in the world that then they can all collectively refer to. So they can say, this thing that we're discussing right now is like that rock that the person that we all know about broke in half and then put back together again 3 years ago. And like that language form is what the book's actually about. But the reason that the humans want to talk to the aliens is that the aliens can do things with biotechnology that humans can't. And it's
well, here's my concern about the potential for cyberpunk to continue into the future. In much the same way that cell phones have had a kind of deleterious effect on filmmaking, my concern is that as our technology becomes more and more focused around the instantaneous sharing of information, it will come to a point where no media format will really be able to adequately express it in a way that is artistically viable or enjoyable to experience, or really particularly thought-provoking, because what you'll be doing is trying to replicate the experience of plugging vast numbers of data streams into your head all at the same time, and switching between the same 3 websites over and over again has limited appeal.
Yeah. I mean, certain, and I think, I don't know that that's a function of technology so much as it's a function of the fact that the corporations that own the technology are either monopolies or monopsonies or both. And there may be steps taken to try and deal with that in various ways, who knows. I feel like in the same way that humans are tool-using animals, we are also art-making animals. And I feel like no matter what the constraints of the technology are, humans will find a way to, at the very least, subvert it for the purpose of dumb jokes. And that's kind of the precursor to art in a lot of ways.
I guess I should have a little more faith in the artists. There's no problem they can't solve to a degree.
So, for example, I can't remember the precise puns. So viewers and listeners are invited to do their own research. But there was this phenomenon where what's the Chinese social network called? Weibo, is that it?
Yeah, Weibo.
There's
maybe.
There's
the Twitter clone.
Yeah, that's the one. There was this trend for a while of people saying these bizarre non sequiturs, and what it was in response to the Chinese government censoring certain kinds of expressions, people started to find things that sounded enough like obscene puns, and then just saying those nonsense phrases over and over again, or finding ways to put them into into conversations that they were already having as a kind of constant low-level shitpost protest against being censored in more high-level ways. There was also an example where someone, I think a young girl, was interviewed in order to justify censorship of the internet within China, and she described the things that she had seen as very pornographic, very violent, but one of those words because of Chinese is tonal, you can shift things subtly and end up with unrelated words that are like sonically close, was yellow for pornographic, I think. And so there became a trend of like people referring to stuff as being very yellow, just as a kind of constant way of pointing out that someone had this very stilted, forced way of speaking imposed on them by the government, and everyone was going to make reference to that.
Yeah, I have a lot of faith in our language's capacity, and our own capacity to use like abstract metaphors and historical allusions to at least stave off the capacity of the censorship AI bots, for long enough. Well, for quite a while anyway. Maybe eventually they'll get so good they'll be able to understand, what happens when you start talking about Henry VIII or whatever. But it's important to realise that as human beings, part of where we're from, like the idea of having a time period when you can really speak completely freely and never have to worry about any level of censorship, is actually a step out of time, and that our entire language was invented within the span of being able to evade kind of understanding by those who are not the message is not intended for.
Yeah, but and there are also, like the Dungeons and Dragons idea of thieves' cant comes from real phenomena. There's was it called Polidori? It's a secret gay language from the 18th century. It's where a lot of stuff that's ended up in modern slang actually comes from. But yeah, there was an entirely separate language spoken by homosexuals in, I think, the 18th century, and might be 19th, to disguise the fact that they were talking about these illicit relationships from everybody else. In fact, I think even the practice of referring to someone who's homosexual as gay comes from there. I might be wrong about that, but I think that's where it comes from.
Well, I know that Cockney rhyming slang was specifically a variety of, making it difficult for anyone who overhears you to figure out what you're actually on about, which certainly works on me. And I don't know what the 21st century variety of Cockney slang will be, but assuming that the evasion is going to be focused against AI bots rather than against eavesdroppers.
You participate to some degree on Twitter, so you will have seen like Bonk go to horny jail, or like there is a level of meme and culture, linguistic mutation which is like specific to Twitter, which I think if you then took back to someone who was not as online as you were, they would find baffling.
Yeah, isn't it interesting how each of the major hubs of internet traffic, like all of the major high traffic websites, are spawning their own speciation of English language already, primarily focused on memetics, obviously, but that's that old canard about how we're going to go back to hieroglyphics because everyone's going to speak in emojis all the time actually has some relevance to it in the sense that there's a Twitter way of communicating and a YouTube way of communicating and a Facebook way of communicating.
And speaking about secret languages to evade authority, there is a way of using emojis for things that they look similar to rather than the things they actually are. Like peach next to water droplets means a specific thing, which was probably not intended by the designer of the emojis in the first instance.
I'm pretty sure that the aubergine was initially entirely innocent.
Aubergines do, because you can't draw dicks in manga. aubergines do have a history of being just like inserted to cover where they would be, even when it's a visual non sequitur. So that's got a reasonably long history in manga, apparently.
Oh, I assumed that was entirely just based on pure coincidence, as the Bonk Go to Horny Jail crowd on Twitter was getting into it. Oh, sorry, what did they say? Getting horny on Maine.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting. It's certainly like it reminds me of the tendency to like create regional accents. I'm reminded of a story which is apocryphal. I have no evidence for it, but I was told by someone that when in Britain they built like Milton Keynes and the other like new towns that were just built whole cloth from the ground up, with no native population, there was a period where the children who lived there developed Australian accents because Neighbours was ubiquitous and there was no regional accent.
Fantastic. Dirty old Neighbours, eh? Well,
yes.
I mean, that's a perfectly cyberpunk occurrence.
Yes, yeah, it is.
Yep. And interestingly, these ghettos of online culture also also bring with them the same varieties of culture that other ghettos of offline culture do. Like, for example, looking down on the inhabitants of other varieties of other ghettos, right?
Yeah. No, there is definitely like a Twitter, Facebook. Mutual distrust.
Yeah.
And there is also both of these platforms are for old people. All the kids are on Snapchat and TikTok.
Yeah. I'm told that even Instagram is starting to be old person territory these days. I'm just looking for
owned by Facebook.
Oh well, there you go. I'm just looking through Neuromancer because there was a quote that was perfectly appropriate, but I don't know if I can find it because I ended up folding quite a few pages because they're all excellent. I'm sure this is riveting viewing.
No. Well, so I mean, by way of a parting thing to mention, I suppose, is that that we also live in an age where people who consider themselves leaders and futurists and elites are not immune to strange cults, which have an entirely online source and existence. I am thinking of all of the people who make an awful lot of money in tech, who then pour that money into charities for AI safety. And the whole concern about AI safety, despite the fact that we don't have what you would consider to be an actual intelligence in any sense yet, comes from a thing called Roko's Basilisk. And so Roko's Basilisk came from a user who had the name Roko. So this is a screen name already, who was on a forum called Less Wrong, which is like a rationalist, heavy air quotes,
right,
blog with a particularly active...
Do they still exist, by the way?
Quote rationalists? Yes, they do.
Okay.
Less, but they suffered a bit with the demise of blogs, but some blogs still fight on, and a lot of blogness migrated into podcasts, because a lot of podcasts are very interactive with their listeners, and also moved into YouTube. But anyway, the thought experiment of Roko's Basilisk goes: let us posit that at some point in the future we have a technological singularity, and that lends itself to the creation of an all-powerful AI. this AI will be sufficiently powerful that it will be able to manipulate time itself, and since its resources will be effectively infinite, it's a logical course of action for that AI to reach back in time and persecute those of us who did not work sufficiently strongly to bring that AI into existence.
Right.
So someone on a forum made up a end of time vengeful god, which can torture you from the future somehow, and people with highly influential positions in the tech industry are still donating to non-profits as an attempt to make sure that it doesn't happen.
Yeah, if you believe Elon Musk's line, he's all very concerned about it and has been trying to convince people to put in place what's required to stop AI from going rogue, or whatever the thing is that is bad that it can do. Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
The thing that Roko's Basilisk reminds me of is the sort of theory fiction angle, this sort of philosophical school of hyper-acceleration. I'm thinking of Nick Land and Negrestani and all of those guys. And there's a sense in which it feels like Nick Land's accelerationism is a sort of logical derivation of cyberpunk to a degree. Although now that I think about it, like classic texts of his, like Circuitries, which I've read for this channel, came out in 92, so they're still within the first wave, you might say. Yeah.
Yeah, I think you could certainly make the case that they're contiguous.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I guess the question then is, how do we inspire the next invigoration of cyberpunk so that it can continue to be something useful for the future?
Well, so I think the important thing for cyberpunk to be meaningful, and I mean, I think this goes for other kinds of science fiction as well, because I'm much more of a fan of your Ursula Le Guin science fiction than I am of your, I can't think of an example now, but someone once made me read a science fiction novel which was very concerned with how the machine guns worked.
Right.
The concern with how people live with the technology or with the society is always the bit that's most interesting and most useful. And I feel like insofar as the technological is an interesting bit of cyberpunk, it's in the way that it's speculative but based on something that seems plausible enough given the current situation that it can reflect very immediately back on our current circumstances. And so I think that continuing to think about the times that we live in and try to speculate our way through I guess thought experiments about different ways of dealing with it is the core that we're talking about. And I think that the appeal of the noirness or the grit, for me at least, is about it's about learning how people survive in particular kinds of adverse environment, and so like the noir versions are about how people negotiate this particular social structure or this particular network of criminal relationships. But I really enjoyed the shared world books, which were a vogue in fantasy and science fiction in the early 90s, which were just about like, here's this weird hostile setting and here's how everybody tries to live in it. And so you would have all of this expansion about just like in this place where we're cut off from the outside world, and currency is meaningless. Here's how our particular barter economy works, and here's how that deals with like someone coming in from the outside after we've been cut off from 15 years and working out that they could print all of Wikipedia and bring it in and like let people look at it on paper because computers don't work for setting reasons, which I won't go into. And just like all of that human stuff about relationships and economies, in the sense that, you know, people always need stuff they don't have and are willing to trade it with other people who have it and need other stuff that they don't have. I think a focus on the humanness of all of that is what's important.
I think so too. What do you make of vaporwave?
I think that vaporwave is like, it's a fascinating case of the way that the internet has made the transition from jokes to actual things way easier to do. You know, there was this one-off joke about captures, you know, like back when captures used to be a sequence of, like, they used to be two words that would be randomized next to each other and you had to type them back. And they said, like, summon Iglip. And that spawned this entire subculture of people who first jokingly, and then because they were really into the subculture, had this whole thing about worshipping the god Iglip. And I kind of feel like the same thing happened with vaporwave. Like, it starts as a really obvious and quite clever joke, but then some people start taking it really seriously and trying to work out how to get really good at it. And now elements of it are bleeding back into the musical mainstream, because music production for the last, since the beginning of recorded music, has always had some element of nostalgia for the way that the previous generation's technology failed. Like, guitar distortion comes from broken speaker cabinets, and then trying to do that without breaking speaker cabinets. Vaporwave is all about like replicating the flaws of magnetic tape, all of the warp and the ways that things fade and go out of tune because the tapes got slack, and evoking a sort of deliberately cheesy nostalgia, because the nostalgia is for this hyper-commercialized, hyper-controlled space of a mall, which doesn't really exist because malls were in some ways a financial scam and millions of them failed, so they're just abandoned everywhere.
Well, they're all dead now, that's for sure.
But you know, like the period of hanging out at the mall was actually a phenomenon kind of roughly around the time that we were teenagers, but in America. And then it doesn't really exist in the same way for subsequent generations. It hasn't, because the malls weren't actually as financially bulletproof as they thought they were. It
was a surprisingly brief phenomenon, actually.
Yeah.
Which, again, a perfectly cyberpunk thing. That cities get completely rearranged and focused around a new financial model that only lasts 10 to 15 years and leaves in its wake these immense, unusable architectural silos.
I mean, so there's two things about that. One, you can trace that back into the history of commentaries on capitalism, because if you think about a game of Monopoly, that is the precise experience of the human beings living in the city that is simulated by a game of Monopoly. Like, all of these people go around and build this enormously expensive shit and go bankrupt one by one. And they're new, different, completely expensive shit. but also there's actually a Gibson story that talks about this. It's in a collection called Burning Chrome, and the story is called the Gernsback Continuum.
Mm-hmm.
So what it's about is this guy who's sent out as a photographer to take photos of like abandoned futuristic 50s buildings. The period in American architecture where everything looked like Buck Rogers' spaceship. Everything has fins and is aerodynamic even if it stays still. Mm-hmm. And he begins to be haunted by the ghost of 1950s science fiction. Like he starts seeing perfectly aerodynamic Art Deco spaceships come down, and like people in skin tight silver suits come out and have picnics where they eat tiny, like one meal and a pill pills and then fly away again and stuff.
Yeah.
And he gets told that the way to exercise it, in the sense of exercising a demon, is to like indulge in the lowest possible culture from his own time that he can find.
So he spends all of his time buying lava lamps from 1970s Tampa thrift shops.
Well, no, the recommendation he's giving, because this is like 1981, is like go watch like the most cheaply mass-produced pornography you can find as starter and work from there. Just the lowest common denominator of our time to try and like just blast it out of you.
I was looking at some 1950s cars recently and loving their kind of Jetsons styling. And I think, yeah, we definitely can't underestimate the importance of the rocket age, even though it's overlooked as like a fundamental piece of kind of the West's understanding of itself. And especially as it kind of came out of the United States into the rest of the West. But where does it fit into the history of cyberpunk?
Well, I mean, I think it fits into cyberpunk partly as like the prog to its punk. Like it was a thing that had become very self-regarding and formalized at the point at which cyberpunk was a new thing. And so cyberpunk was in many ways people kicking down doors and shouting and waving branches around and hooting, and doing the perennial artistic cry of everything old people like is crap, this is real art.
And undercutting the space opera, right?
Yeah, definitely. And so I think it has that relationship to it, but also I think the Gernsback Continuum is telling in that these people would have been living with some element of that, the way that kind of science fiction had bled back into consumer culture around them as abandoned or still extant, but no longer like as current stuff. Because there still are like Art Deco buildings that look like spaceships. There still are like 60s buildings where people decided they wanted to live in half a soccer ball covered in spherical windows. Like these moments create these artifacts. Like you were talking to the guy, the Unruly Heritage guy, about like the sticky stuff. And you can never quite predict what it is that's going to persist.
Yeah, Stein Fasterval, he's very clear about the fact that the things that we build we can't predict actually what will happen with them.
No, I mean, I don't know if you remember my parents' old house in Dunedin that was built as the manse for the church down the road, and it had 2 front doors. Like you could go in the front door, but then there was immediately another door that you couldn't go through until the servants let you in, and there was an antechamber off that like first little tiny space, which they used as a guest bedroom, but would originally be where you wait when you want to see the minister for something.
Like a sort of atrium for God. God's intermediary.
Yeah, and it's now like they've sold it and another family's living in it, but it's a family home, but it's got this odd feature of like there's this extra complete living room worth of space that's separated for the rest of the house for no particular reason now.
Well, yeah, seeing as we know that happens, I wonder what the digital online version of that is. Like has MySpace become a museum, or has it just been deleted?
Well, that's interesting, because I mean, a lot of that stuff is deleted, and a lot of it was kind of sadly lamented when it was deleted. There was quite a kind of community outcry when GeoCities finally went away forever. So that's one of the things that's strange about the internet, is that, well, it's not strange really if you think about it compared to physical archaeology, because we don't find everything that existed in the past. We find whatever lasts for whatever reason it lasted for. So there are things like the Internet Archive, which manages to preserve odd bits and pieces of things, and it's very hit and miss, and you never know quite exactly what it's going to manage to save. But yeah, sites like MySpace and Bebo and GeoCities were just taken offline and gone forever. There are some odd outliers. I saw an article a while back, I can't remember where it was, unfortunately, but about someone going and being the only person playing the original Team Fortress that ran on Quake 1, because there are still like a few Team Fortress servers running for reasons that aren't clear somewhere in the world, so you can boot up your copy of Quake and launch Team Fortress as a mod and then find a server, but no one will be on it, and you can just wander around this empty multiplayer map by yourself.
How odd to, like, I wonder what anybody gains from that, or if it's just all fallen into like forgotten. It's become a forgotten realms.
Well, that's it. I'm guessing that it's just there's something that no one's switched off yet because they've forgotten what it does.
See, in this way, there's this really odd kind of temporal dynamic that occurs if, when we move everything online, A, there's no future because everybody's wrapped up in the present, but B, everything that is not financially incentivized to be continued disappears. In some sense, it removes time. So, like, from a geopolitical perspective, I think about the period from the fall of the Berlin Wall to the fall of the Twin Towers, that period as being a moment out of time, because there was no kind of like major war that was occurring at that point. Or if you wanted to extend it even further, you could say from the beginning of the Cold War until now, if you're willing to say that there was a frozen conflict in the Cold War. Yeah. But taking that phrase, like a moment out of time, going online takes us out of a time as well, and kind of just locks us into this permanent present.
It's very strange. I think there are increasing moves to historicize the internet. So I've been listening to a podcast called Lolita Podcast, which is, I mean, it's one of these documentary podcasts that's got a kind of defined beginning, middle, and end, but it's about Nabokov's Lolita and the ways in which it has been interpreted in adaptation and inspired stuff in the culture, and the ways in which that's been unhelpful in lots of people's lives. But really interestingly, towards the end of that series, they talk to this young woman who had participated in a particular era of Tumblr culture around, I forget exactly, it's like a fandom for a specific aspect of the book, not necessarily the book entirely itself, and I can't remember exactly what thing it was. But the interesting thing was that she was this woman in her mid-20s, I would say, and she had kind of created a role for herself as a historian of this particular fandom in this particular space and time, because Tumblr had deleted a huge amount of stuff, so she had to archive things as they were about to be deleted and store them somewhere so that they were there for reference. And it was really interesting that there was this, because I was of an age where like I completely bypassed the Tumblr phenomenon in my internet experience.
Sure.
I went straight from forums to social networks, basically. But it was this kind of complete subculture that then had all of these impacts outside of itself. And there were people who were there at the time who had realized at some point the historicity of what was happening and the need to take some sort of step to preserve some kind of record of what had gone on so that people could make sense of where we were at later.
Yeah, it's... In some sense, it seems sad that there's a lot of things that have just disappeared, that have gone in the wind. But when I reflect on it, actually what it makes obvious to me is not that that's a new phenomenon, but that actually much of the past has also disappeared in exactly the same way. And that actually it was only because it had disappeared, we hadn't thought about it. And it's only when we actually witness something being disappeared that we go, oh wait, stuff just goes away and it's never thought of again.
Yeah, and we don't necessarily get to pick and choose what persists and why. I'm thinking of the thing where, I can't remember what it was now, but there was a bit of untranslatable something for a long time, and then someone finally unlocked the key to understanding it, and it turned out to be like just accounting. We got so many pounds of copper from these people and they got so many pigs from us, because that
probably
was
some of those old Sumerian tablets.
Yeah, and that was what was important to make sure was written down and then carefully preserved, because it was highly important economic information. And now we're like, but we want to know what these people thought about stuff. And what we have is how many pounds of copper they got from so-and-so.
Yeah, I heard that one of the very first Sumerian tablets that we ever had was one that had been stored in a building that had burnt down, so the tablet had accidentally been fired, and that's why it survived. And it was a letter complaining about somebody's delivery being underweight or something or other.
And consequently, we are invited to speculate about a future where, it's, due to some quirk of fate, the only bit of the current internet that persists into the future is Yelp. And so future historians find nothing but complaints about customer service.
I'm imagining some like massively integrated AI-assisted future archaeological semi-human brain whose only contact with the late 20th century is 40,000 GoDaddy searches.
Well, are you familiar? So I should probably go pretty soon.
Right.
It's been lovely to talk to you. But
likewise.
Are you familiar with the Motel of the Dead?
No.
So it's a picture book for grown-ups. Like, it's one of those large format books with lots of pictures, but the text is clearly for grown-ups. But I read it when I was a kid and didn't really understand it at the time. But the conceit, I think it's from the late 70s, might be the early 80s. The conceit is at some point there's so much smog in the sky over LA that it just forms into a solid sheet and falls out of the sky and kills everyone while perfectly preserving everything underneath it, like Pompeii. But the actual book is about people unearthing this late 20th century low rent motel and trying to work out what everything is. And they get completely baffled by everything. They decide that the toilet seat is some sort of ceremonial shoulder and headdress, because you can like take it off and put the seat around your neck and have the like lids up behind your head.
Perfect sense. Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it's a kind of shit post about archaeology, but you always have that kind of concern about it. And certainly I've seen a few things recently where people have talked about, like, we couldn't work out what this particular thing was, and then we took it to a modern leather worker and they went, oh yeah, no, I still use a tool that's exactly like that because that's just how you smooth leather. And so, if you don't have connection with people who use the same kind of tool, it can be really hard to work out just from the object what the logic of that object is. And I imagine like doubly so when you look at the internet, particularly because a lot of the internet these days is like architecture. We are talking on the internet, but we are not performing the web operations that make that talking on the internet possible. We just have a tool that says, have a conversation with this person, and you push the button and it goes. But there's a whole bunch of architecture underneath that's doing all of these things. And all of the apps on my phone where I can play like games of Scrabble with strangers, they're doing all of this complicated stuff on the internet, but I don't really experience it as being on the internet. I just like, oh, this person has taken their turn, I'll take my turn.
Yeah, when you think about exactly how little is understood, or let me put that another way, how few people understand what is going on, like what hope will future archaeologists have?
No, it's because you're then getting into archaeology of information systems.
And they don't exist unless they're running. So
yeah.
You just instantiate them and go, yeah, it's likely it was something like that, I suppose.
And in fact, being able to run the information system is dependent in some cases on having the correct hardware configuration. Apparently part of the reason that people have never, or not since the first PlayStation 3, have they incorporated the PlayStation 2, is that the architecture of the PlayStation 2 is radically different from everything that came after it, to a degree that like even emulating a PlayStation 2 on a modern computer sometimes cooks it. Because the architecture is so alien that it bends things sideways.
Fantastic. I mean, if there's one thing that Cyberpunk is all about, it's about architecture and technology bending everything sideways. Yeah.
That it is.
And how it bends us. Yeah. All right. Very good. Thank you for your time.
Oh, thank you for having me on.